So the context for this session is that there are a multitude of ways of acting on climate at many levels. Some of us act through the relationship of climate and health. Some of us act at the grassroots. Some of us act on policy. And we're looking at a particularly interesting mode of action chosen by altruistic lawyers who have got together to use their professional skills to move climate action forward. But before I really begin an introduction of our speakers, let me say a little bit about how our evening will proceed. I'll introduce Jessica, and we will then hear from her for 30, 40 minutes, and then we'll move to question, answers, and discussion. You don't need to confine yourself entirely to questions. You can make short comments, but do make them succinct. And it's helpful if you put your questions in chat, then I can sequence them better in terms of content, and make things flow better. So put your questions in chat. Later on, if we have time, we may take questions and discussion orally. But let's start by putting your questions into chat. And please remember to mute your microphones now. And I will now move to introduce our speaker, Jessica Palairet, who is Lawyers for Climate Action New Zealand's Executive Director. Jessica is a lawyer and has a Master's of Law from New York University, specializing in international climate litigation. I'm pretty delighted to know that that is a specialty, Jessica. Jessica started her role with Lawyers for Climate Action on her return to New Zealand in late 2023. Before working at Lawyers for Climate Action, Jessica worked at the High Court as a judge's clerk, at Shortland Chambers as a junior barrister, and as an International Human Rights Fellow at the UN in New York, a position I imagine she was selected for. So Jessica, thank you so much for your time in being with us, and welcome to this webinar.
Kia ora, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Joanna. And it is such a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you all. And thank you for giving up your Thursday evening to come hear me talk about climate change litigation and how we're using the law to enable more effective action on climate change in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And it's beautiful to hear you describe us as sister organisations. I think that's really, really fair. And I'm really excited to share more about our work, and in particular look at ways we could collaborate moving forward as well. So who are we at Lawyers for Climate Action New Zealand? I thought I would provide a little bit of context on this for those who aren't so familiar. We were founded back in 2019, and a group of, I'd say, frustrated lawyers looking at the state of play in the climate crisis and the lack of action that was happening. And as a group of lawyers going, let's use our legal skills and education to do something. And so what started off as a small organisation has now grown into an organisation with over 370 members nationwide. Oh. We've brought and been involved in 4 or 5 climate litigation cases. We have written dozens of legal and policy submissions. And we ultimately work to unlock the pro bono effort of our volunteer lawyers across the country who want to use their legal skill to make a difference on climate change. And we do that through advocating for better law and policy, bringing strategic climate litigation, and then also partnering with community groups and actually bringing legal muscle to community climate action. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but the essence of that is that we know that the law is a really powerful tool, but you need to be, have a law degree and know the right people, and it costs a lot of money in order to use it. So how can we actually democratize the law and the legal system so that community groups are better able to access it. And so in terms of, I think, some context, why does this all matter? And this is going to be very familiar content to, I'm going to say, all of you, but I think it's really important when we do talk about climate to put a bit of science up front, to put what we're talking about really in context. This was a tweet which I saw last week, actually. Bernard Hickey had reposted it in his morning kaka. And I think it shows something quite scary, which is that August 2024 was 1.49 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And if you may recall, the world in 2016 signed up to a Paris Agreement, which aims to restrict warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And I think it is very scary that 8 years after that, the world is on the precipice of blowing past that target already. The other thing that this tweet shows is that every single year seems to be a new record breaker, with every single year seemingly hotter than the last. The trajectory that we're on is not going to be enough to avert the worst consequences of the climate crisis. And what does this mean on the ground? Well, again, these are some recent stories. The top left picture is of a storm in the last week in Europe, which is causing deaths in Europe as a result of the extreme weather event. We have heat stroke, which were devastating, particularly in India in this last year as well. Things that people have been writing and talking about for years that you might find in climate fiction are actually coming true before our very own eyes. And the bottom picture is here in Aotearoa. This is the effect of Cyclone Gabrielle in the communities around the Hawke's Bay, a devastating climate event, which I would have hoped would have changed the narrative in Aotearoa for climate action, the need for stronger adaptation and mitigation policies. But I'm not sure it had the effect that I was hoping that I would have expected after the devastation that ripped through the country last year. And then here's the other reason that our work matters. In the context of that, in the context of us looking like we're about to blow past the Paris Agreement targets, breaking records every year for temperature rising, in the context of that temperature increase and the effects of climate change, the effects that they're having on communities all around the world, including at home. In the context of all of that, what's New Zealand doing about it? And why does our work matter? Well, New Zealand's rating according to the Climate Action Tracker is highly insufficient. That measures our climate targets, that measures our climate policies. And what I think is concerning about this is that this is old. This was based off the former government climate policies and climate targets. I would expect it to be even worse now, given I think we are seeing some concerning backtracking on all of those fronts. And what we have in the very bottom part of the slide is a quote from the Climate Change Commission. That's New Zealand's independent expert scientific body that advises the government on its climate policy. And earlier this year, it produced its first monitoring report where it steps back and it goes, based on New Zealand's climate targets and based on our climate plans and policies, how are we tracking? And what they said is that there's an urgent need to strengthen our policies and strategies so that we can be on track to meet future emissions budgets in the 2050 target. And they quite concerningly warned that we weren't going to be on track to meet the 2050 target and to meet some of our other climate targets based on current policy, which I think is a very concerning and sobering start to this talk. But I think it's one which I think is important to have. And so what do we do about it at Lawyers for Climate Action? Well, we know that the climate crisis is a systemic problem and it requires system-level change. And the law, the legal system, is one of the most effective available systems at our discretion. And that's why the law matters so much. But it's a lever that we can pull to increase accountability across decision makers and major corporates, increase ambition by ensuring that the laws we have in the first place are robust and strong and going to be fit for purpose and do the job that we need them to do, set the incentives that we need them to set, and then ultimately actually drive the systemic change that we need in society to really tackle the climate crisis. That's why the laws matter. The laws on the ground, what they actually are, matters a great deal, but there's also an implementation gap. It's all very well and good having laws, but they're just words on a page unless they're actually implemented and enforced. And that's where we come in as an organisation. And so what's climate litigation? Well, it's the enforcement part, principally, of what I just set out before. And it's one of the most rapidly growing fields of law actually in the world. There are over 2,660 cases filed worldwide, and that was according to a study that was published earlier this year by the London Great Institute at the London School of Economics. A huge number of cases, and 75% of those have been filed in the last 8 years since the Paris Agreement was signed. Why are we seeing so much climate litigation? Well, one is because lawyers and community groups and NGOs and activists want to see stronger law and policy, and courts are one way of doing that. And then two, there's this accountability gap, and people are turning to the courts, I think, out of a sense of frustration for not being able to hold decision makers accountable, for making decisions now that are going to affect the trajectory of the world and going to affect future communities. So that's why we're seeing this turn towards the court. And I think that the statistics and the reach and the global nature of climate litigation is really quite fascinating. You can see here that New Zealand's actually not doing too badly on the climate litigation front. We've had, I think this shows between 21 and 54 cases. I think it's sitting at around 35 cases filed in New Zealand at the moment, depending on how you count it. There's a lot of activity happening in the United States, a lot of activity happening in the UK, and also Brazil, particularly in relation to the deforestation of the Amazon and the risk of that becoming a tipping point for future climatic events. And so I think that again, situating this discussion in this global picture is a really, really interesting and important one. The other stat I put up there is to show you the distinction and the division between different climate litigation cases and how they're playing out around the world. This is also from the London School of Economics, Grantham Institute, the statistic here. And you can see that cases currently are dominated by the global north. There's been very little activity, as you can see, particularly in Africa. But I'd expect that to start to change. And the other development, which I'll touch on soon, is the turn to international courts, which is what that yellow international pizza wedge is showing in the pie chart. And I'll provide a little example of that soon. So what are the kind of types of climate litigation? Well, there's an awful lot of different types. Any law that relates to climate or that should relate to climate has probably been tested in one court and around the world as part of those 2,600 cases. So we've got a case which you refer to as government framework cases. Those are cases that are challenging the integrity and overall ambition and accountability of a framework law. So in our case, the Zero Carbon Amendment Act, the Climate Change Response Act, cases challenging a government's overall approach. We have greenwashing proceedings. I'll give an example of one of these happening in New Zealand later on in this talk. But that's challenging companies for making misleading and deceptive green claims to try to give themselves a green halo when trying to market their product to consumers, where what's being said isn't necessarily being matched up by what's actually happening behind the scenes in the product's life cycle. The third case is a really interesting category: polluter pays and corporate accountability. Again, I'm going to give an example of this with Smith and Fonterra later on in this talk, but this is where climate activists are going to court to try hold companies accountable for the harms of their emissions and actually get some financial redress as a response as well. A fourth category is what we call integrating climate considerations. So this is saying that even if the decision doesn't explicitly affect or relate to climate change, when should decision makers have to take climate change into account anyway? An obvious example is the granting of oil or gas or coal exploration and mining permits. Often those decisions under a statutory regime don't require climate change to be taken into account, but lawyers like me think that they should be. And there's a raft of cases around the world dealing with that as one example. The international climate litigation going to bodies like the ICJ or the International Criminal Court or the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. These are transnational transnational bodies to try and resolve questions in between states. That's the picture we've talked about a little bit earlier. We're seeing increasing recourse to that, including by Pacific Island nations. This is something I'll come back to a little bit later. And then the final category is human rights cases. So trying to argue that climate change is a human rights issue. And as a result, states and different actors and entities have obligations under human rights law to act on climate change. New Zealand is a little bit behind the eight ball on this particular one, and that's because climate change isn't really recognised as a human rights issue in New Zealand under New Zealand law. Lawyers for Climate Action, one of the non-litigation but more policy-oriented pieces of work that we've been doing for the last 5 years, is to try and get the recognition of a right to a sustainable and healthy environment in New Zealand's Bill of Rights Act. That was one of the first things we ever did as an organisation back in 2019, and got a real huge level of support from the legal community actually for that right, on the basis that you can't exercise other human rights without a planetary system that is safe and habitable. All other human rights depend on the right to a sustainable and healthy environment. It's foundational, it's a bedrock. And it doesn't really make much sense to have a Bill of Rights that says you have a right to freedom of assembly, a right to freedom of expression, if there is no habitable planet in which to live. And then that also opens up the door to a whole lot of really important discussions about the way that we treat nature and the way that we view humans within a wider ecosystem. So we made all these arguments and managed to convince James Shaw to pick it up as a members' bill. It went to Parliament earlier this year as part of its first reading, and was voted down by the majority government, unfortunately. But it was the first time it had ever been discussed and considered before. And we don't think that this discussion is over in New Zealand. We're in the bottom 20% in the world and not recognising this right. And we think that its time will only come. So human rights litigation is a little trickier in New Zealand as a result of that. We can still make arguments under the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, and we are starting to see that, but probably not as strong as in other countries, largely for that reason. So that's a very high-level overview. But to be honest, I think the best way to talk about climate litigation is to talk about some examples. Because at its heart, court cases are stories. They're people who are wanting to bring a story to a judge and are wanting to enforce the law, but in relation to a specific set of facts. And that's why I think this should be a really interesting way of talking you through some of the really big international decisions here. So what's the first one? Well, I've chosen this as the first case to talk about because it is the landmark climate litigation decision that many credit with really sparking the entire global climate litigation movement that's now got over 2,600 cases. And this was in the Netherlands by a group of 900 Dutch citizens and an environmental NGO, a little bit like ours, called the Agenda Foundation. And they sued the Dutch government, asking for them to do more to prevent global climate change. And this was brought under the European Convention of Human Rights, under the right to a family life and the right to life and the right to a private family life. The translation's a little bit off, but broadly those are the two rights that it was brought under, as well as a raft of other things. But the Hague District Court, which was then upheld by the Supreme Court in Netherlands in 2019, held that as a matter of human rights law, the Dutch government had to do more than it was currently doing. And they looked at what the IPCC had said was required to put the world on a trajectory that was in line with the Paris Agreement, and essentially said the Dutch government and their climate target fell short of what was going to be required according to IPCC science, and as a matter of human rights protection, had to go further. This was a humongous decision, and I pulled out here two, I think, really strong quotes from the court. The Hague District Court saying that climate policy should not only start from what's most beneficial to the current generation at this moment, but also what it means for future generations, so that future generations are not exclusively and disproportionately burdened with the consequences of climate change. An incredibly strong statement from the court, the kind of thing we wish our political leaders thought about a little bit more, coming out of a court of law, thinking about the rights of future generations. The other really important statement that came out of this case, and one of the reasons why many do refer to it as one of the landmark decisions, is because what the government had tried to argue is, well, what we do doesn't matter, because we could reduce our emissions by a huge degree, but if other countries don't reduce their emissions, well, it won't matter really what we do, and we'll just be harming our economy and going through this huge transition for not much. And the court really pushed back on this argument. And actually, you'll find that in part because of this decision, I think, the world have really pushed back against that argument. And said quite explicitly that a state cannot avoid an individual responsibility on the basis that other states aren't complying with their own responsibilities. A real call to action for individual states to all play their fair share. We have raised these arguments in New Zealand courts as well, and I don't think any court in New Zealand has ever actually disagreed with this statement. And I've started with this one because we're still seeing the impacts of this kind of litigation reverberate around the world today. Earlier this year, there was a really exciting case brought by 2,000 elderly women who took the Swiss government to court, arguing that the Swiss government's inaction was a breach of their fundamental human rights. So they borrowed a lot from the kind of agenda arguments I was talking about, but raised it within a more international tribunal, the European Court of Human Rights. And the European Court of Human Rights in April of this year agreed and went really far in actually telling the Swiss government what they needed to do. The Swiss government, to my knowledge, was actually missing the kind of framework laws and the kind of targets that even we have in New Zealand in terms of what's required for us to play our fair share. And what the European Court of Human Rights said is that, yes, some groups, like elderly women, are particularly disadvantaged by the effects of climate change, pointing particularly to heat waves. And there was a whole heap of science in the court about the particular effects of a heating planet on older people. The second thing is that states are obliged as a matter of human rights law to protect their citizens from those kinds of human rights risks and abuses. And then third, and this is where we've got, I think, the court went further than I could even imagine a court doing in New Zealand, which is to say, here is what a state needs to do to protect human rights in light of the climate crisis. Things like having long-term and immediate targets, showing that a state is actually complying with those targets, updating them with new evidence, acting in good time, not leaving it until it's too late. Hugely significant findings to come out of the European Court of Human Rights just this year. And already we're seeing this case being picked up by other jurisdictions. I believe it's Poland, a group has filed a very similar case, taking this finding and saying, hey, Polish government, what are you doing? Are you actually meeting your obligations as well? So that's where you see the impact from one jurisdiction having effects in others, which is a really exciting part in this space as well. And similarly to agenda, I've pulled out a couple of quotes which I thought were really significant. The court again saying that each state has to take and pay its share of responsibilities, rather than looking at what other states are doing or not doing. Each state has to play their fair share and play their part. Again, some really powerful statements about future generations and what happens today, not placing disproportionate burdens on future generations, and the need for authority to take immediate, effective, and consistent action. And then the final quote which I've pulled out, again, is talking about rights. The right to a private and family life must be seen as encompassing a right for individuals to effective protection by state authorities from serious adverse effects of climate change on their life, health, well-being, and quality of life. We're yet to see decisions like this in New Zealand, although there are some that are starting to move through the court. But I think that this kind of really foundational understanding of climate change as a human rights issue, you can really see that take hold in Europe, and it'll be really exciting to see what's to come. What about an example that's slightly closer to home? This here is a statement from the former Prime Minister of Vanuatu. And what it relates to is a really exciting claim being brought to the International Court of Justice, which is an international body that's currently writing, and it's going to be an advisory opinion on state obligations with respect to climate change. The reason I say this is a bit closer to home is that this global court proceeding was started by students out in Vanuatu. And it was a claim that was started out by students who were studying climate change, thinking about the existential threat that climate change posed to the Pacific Islands, and managed to convince the Pacific Island Forum to put a resolution forward and garnered support from other states. New Zealand was one of them, to actually get this heard before the International Court of Justice. And the aim of this is to clarify what states' duties and obligations are. And the idea is that once they're clarified on an international level, lawyers like us, groups like you, can actually take those findings from a really esteemed international legal tribunal and take them to our own domestic courts and our own domestic governments and say, hey, under international law, this is your obligation. Are you meeting your international obligations? As there still is a bit of uncertainty about some aspects of international law, for instance, about human rights law. The aim of this is to get our authoritative statements that are going to influence domestic courts and decisions all around the world. And this was started out in the Pacific Islands, which I think is such an incredibly powerful thing to have been able to do, started by a group of students reaching an international court. We were a little bit involved behind the scenes with NFAT to try and implement what New Zealand's submission for the ICJ was going to be in terms of what states' obligations are. And hearings, I believe, start in 66 days. And so this is absolutely one to keep on your radar. We'd expect to see a decision on that in the coming kind of months. There was another big decision actually by the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea earlier this year, looking at what states' obligations are in relation to ocean law. And that sounds a little bit drier potentially than this one, but that is actually also a really significant decision. As the tribunal in that case said that global greenhouse gas emissions are a form of marine pollution and a form of ocean pollution, and as a result of that, states have obligations under the law of the sea that stand aside of the Paris Agreement to reduce the harmful effects of climate change, aka by doing better on climate change mitigation, even under the international law of the sea. So we're starting to see, and that was really the first one, and people view that as a precursor, I would say, to the ICJ advisory opinion. We're starting to see this real pressure building even in the international legal system on what states have to do. And it's really being led by the Pacific Islands, which I think is really exciting. So that's a bit of a scan internationally. But I said 2,600 cases. I could talk about a lot, but I think they're some of the most interesting ones. What about a little bit closer to home? All right, let's talk about a case that we actually brought. So we brought a case last year against the Minister for Climate Change. And this was a case in relation to New Zealand's emissions trading scheme. And I'll try not to get too wonky and bogged down in the details here. But essentially, what we were challenging is decisions that the minister had made about the ETS's price and unit setting. So just at a really high level, the emissions trading scheme is one of New Zealand's main policy levers for addressing the climate crisis. And it does that by setting a price on carbon that a decent portion of New Zealand emitters have to basically pay or trade in order to emit carbon as part of their operations, basically. And the government sets a kind of floor price that goes through an auction and a number of units that could ever be auctioned. And the aim of the game is to set a price on carbon that's going to be high enough to incentivize emissions reduction. So the idea is that if emissions emitting carbon is too expensive, it's cheaper for companies just to decarbonize, so that they have to lower the amount that they have to pay to offset or reduce their emissions. I'll try to kind of cap it at that, because I think that to understand the case, that's useful, but not actually essential context. What we have here is the minister in cabinet made some decisions about New Zealand's ETS that differed from what the Climate Change Commission said. So the Climate Change Commission said, oh, you need to set a price at, I can't remember the number on the top of my head, $75 a tonne. And this is the price that's going to incentivize the emissions reductions. That's going to mean the ETS is working well. And Cabinet got around a table and decided not to follow the Climate Change Commission's advice. And instead they put the price of their own figures. And what we said is, hold on, you've not followed the advice of your independent expert body, and you've not provided reasons. They didn't do modelling or the kind of analysis that the statute required them to make a decision. They kind of just set a carbon price and kind of gone from there. We said, well, if this is one of your main tools for reducing emissions, you need to have it backed up by the evidence, and you need to make the decision in line with all the things that the Climate Change Response Act said you had to make the decision in line with. And so we put Minister James Shaw to court for that. And this graph here shows you the impact of the decision. So you can see the price of carbon units. I'm sorry that the timescale seems to have been left off the bottom. You can see the price of carbon units for the decision. Then the next part of the graph shows you how much the price of carbon fell after the Cabinet decided to reduce the price. They actually didn't even decide to reduce the price as low as it shows on this graph. The problem was that by making the decision and not following the Climate Change Commission's advice, it added a whole heap of uncertainty to the market, to the carbon market, and really decreased the price quite significantly. For context, I believe that the social cost of carbon is around $200. And so we're far, far below what that would be. And there's also been some evidence, I think, from NFE that the price of carbon that will really start to incentivize emissions reductions is well over $100. So I think that's quite important context. When you see the price hovering at $35, that was a really concerning state of play for New Zealand's carbon market. So we brought our case, but was resolved actually very quickly because the government basically agreed with us. They basically thought that they saw our statement of claim and our submissions and went, oh, maybe we didn't actually follow the requirements of the Climate Change Response Act, which is very unheard of. And the case was resolved within months of us filing it, which is a really, really quick proceeding. I think that the case was heard and it was almost by the end of that month, a judgment was out. And once the judgment was out, the judge said you have to go back and follow the analysis that the Climate Change Response Act requires of you and make the decision again. And that's what we see at the final part of that graph, which is that the Cabinet and Minister made the decisions again, picked up the Climate Change Commission's advice, followed it, and the price has been recovered almost immediately. And the overall impact on the value of New Zealand's carbon market was about $3 billion. A humongous shift in the market as a result of the litigation. And we're actually already seeing impacts of that litigation even under this government. So it was last month, the government made its decision on the ETS price and unit settings. This was the first time the government had made a decision since our case last year. And the government had done some concerning things in its consultation and had suggested that it would get rid of a price or change the price corridor and actually reduce it altogether. But they didn't do it. They actually followed the Climate Change Commission's advice and have been really heralded for doing so. And I think in no short part, that was because of the precedent that this case set in terms of if you're a minister, what do you need to do when you're making this really important decision? It's wonky, it's technical, it's detailed, but this really does matter. It's really the detail for New Zealand and really such a key lever for New Zealand's climate policy response. So that's a domestic example. What about another one? This is one that I'm guessing maybe more people have heard of as opposed to the emissions trading scheme case. This is a really significant, and I mean that, a world-leading case. Around the world, people will tell me they know two things about New Zealand. They will have heard of the Cinderella and they will have heard about this case. And I say people, this within probably climate litigation circles, so maybe it's a little bit smaller than maybe the average person you'd meet overseas. But it's a case that's going really far and wide. And so Mike Smith is bringing 7 of New Zealand's largest emitting companies responsible for about 1/3 of New Zealand's total emissions court. And he's doing that by arguing that those companies owe duties under tort law. That's a form of common law as opposed to statute kind of made by Parliament. Under tort law, they should be held responsible for the harms of their emissions and actually should be able to, or should be required to pay out compensation for the harms that their emissions cause people like Mike Smith. And this is a really bold claim, as I said, because it's not judge-made law, it's common law that moves through the courts rather than being decided through Parliament. And the potential implications of having a duty like this on major admitting companies are really significant, as I'm sure you can imagine. And this is why the defendants aren't too happy about it. And right at the very first instance, once Mike Smith files his claim, thought to strike it out. And so when you strike out a claim, that's when you argue that something is so untenable that it can't possibly succeed and a court shouldn't even be able to hear it. That's what the defendants argued. They argued it semi-successfully in the High Court. So in the High Court, Mike Smith got 3 claims, and I think the High Court allowed one of them and struck 2 of them out. So Mike appealed, and he appealed up to the Court of Appeal. And at the Court of Appeal, they struck all of the claims out. They said they're too untenable, too much of a stretch for tort law. We can't prove that volunteer admissions are causing this amount of harm. That causation link is too difficult to show. And they're also concerned about things like opening the floodgates of liability. Where would it stop if you were to start introducing tortious liability like that? So then Mike appealed to the highest court in New Zealand, the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court unanimously allowed all of his claims to move forward, didn't strike any of them out, which was the furthest than any court had really gone. And what they said is that Mike Smith now gets his day in court. These are all quotes. They accepted all the science of climate change at the beginning of the judgment, actually just outlined in really powerful terms, not dissimilar to what we were saying from the European Courts of Human Rights that I was talking about earlier. In fact, I'm fairly confident they cited agenda. The court was saying that climate science is beyond dispute, that it is going to have significant impacts on current and future generations, that the IPCC science demonstrates what these impacts are, and it's clearly something that the world is going to have to grapple with, and that includes the court. And then the Supreme Court basically said that, sure, it may be a difficult claim, but it's by no means impossible, and courts have actually dealt with other humongous changes to society before, pointing a lot to the Industrial Revolution and the way that law had to develop then to respond to all the new challenges that the Industrial Revolution presented. Why should the law just stand still in face of societal change? Why should we say that it's impossible, so untenable that it can't possibly succeed, that maybe tort law couldn't adjust and adapt now to respond to climate change? That's really what the heart of the case was. So that they haven't said that Mike Smith has won and he'll be able to claim tortious damages from all of these companies, but he said that he should get his day in court. And New Zealand courts are going to be some of the first in the world to test out the principles of tort law in relation to climate. And one of the other reasons this is so significant is because it's judge-made law. What happens in New Zealand is actually potentially going to have a really big impact on other jurisdictions. We're based on law from England that we inherited, right? So it might have implications on English courts, any common law court, any court that was established kind of out of a commonwealth. I think the decision that we're going to get in New Zealand on this case is going to be highly influential internationally. So I think this is a really significant one to keep your eyes on. It's not going to be over. It's not going to be over soon. This is going to probably take years to go through court. It now goes all the way back to the High Court level, where they're going to have probably a pretty complicated trial. And I say that because there is really difficult evidence, right? It's going to be difficult to show causation. It's going to be difficult for Mike Smith to show particular harm. There's going to be an awful lot for him to go through. Lawyers for Climate Action appeared in the Supreme Court to support Mike's case. We appear to argue that tort law should develop and should stand still. And are really keen to kind of continue supporting on it. His lawyers are all pro bono, going up against one of New Zealand's biggest companies, or some of New Zealand's biggest companies. So it really is quite an incredible case. So what's another example? Another pro bono case, one that we're also involved in at the moment, and it's another case dealing with corporate accountability. And this is New Zealand's first ever greenwashing case, but we're bringing alongside Consumer New Zealand and ELI against Z Energy. And this claim we've been working on actually for a number of years, and it relates to an advertising campaign that Z Energy ran. We're in the business of getting out of the petrol business. We're moving with the times, New Zealand. And what we said is that misleading and deceptive because Z Energy at its heart is a petrol company that intends to continue selling petrol to consumers. And if you had a look at their business plans, we didn't think it really showed that Z Energy was moving with the times and getting out of the petrol business. They very much intended to stay in the petrol business and continue selling petrol to consumers. And we thought that essentially this advertising campaign is giving a green halo to Z, making people feel better about going to Z Energy to fill up their car with petrol, are more likely to do that as opposed to competitors, increasing Z Energy's overall market share on the back of claims like this, which is fundamentally, we don't think, are true. I saw someone give a really strong analogy, which would be like if McDonald's said, we are in the business of trying to fight obesity, and that's why they only started marketing their Happy Meal toys rather than all the other food that McDonald's sell. It's kind of a similar point. And what's really interesting about this is it's New Zealand's first ever greenwashing case. And internationally, if we even just go across the ditch to Australia, there are literally hundreds of greenwashing cases, largely brought by Australian regulators, so their equivalent of the Commerce Commission. We tried to get the Commerce Commission to pick this case up, but there just hasn't seemed to be the same appetite for calling out and enforcing greenwashing law in New Zealand. Even though it is a really big problem, again, it's this accountability gap. It's all very well and good having laws saying companies can't mislead and deceive consumers and green claims, companies need to be careful when making green claims. It's all very well and good having that as the law, but if you have no one doing the enforcement side of it, those laws are just going to follow. And so that's part of also what we're trying to achieve in this case, to actually start getting more accountability in New Zealand companies, making them realise if they don't follow the law, they will be held to account, but also develop the law. So it's the first test case that we've ever had on what the law is. So what the court does here is going to be hugely, hugely significant. So this case, in terms of the timeline, we filed it in November last year. We've had one interlocutory, which is kind of a very procedural step. And we're now moving kind of through discovery and expect to be in court arguing the merits of this case next year. One final case which I wanted to talk about. This is a case also being brought by Lawyers for Climate Action, and it's actually against our Climate Change Commission and the Minister for Climate Change. And before getting into it, I did want to provide a little bit of high-level context for what it's all about. If you remember way back at the beginning of this presentation, I talked about something called global government framework litigation. And so those are cases challenging kind of a government implementing its chief framework law, the kind of ambition and accountability on government. What we're doing in this case is arguing that New Zealand's NDC and emissions budget are better than they seem. Are worse than they seem. Are they saying better than they actually are? They're actually less ambitious than what would be required for New Zealand to meet its Paris Agreement obligations to play its fair share, reducing warming to that 1.5 or well below 2-degree target in the Paris Agreement. And thinking about the kind of agenda case that I started this talk with, saying that actually New Zealand needs to play its part. It needs to reduce emissions in line with what the Paris Agreement said. And currently, we're not actually doing that. That's the high level of what this case is about. And to explain that, I've actually borrowed from the Climate Change Commission, but added my own little bit at the top to kind of explain New Zealand's climate framework, because I think it's really interesting and probably helpful for a group like yours anyway. And so what we have is at the very top, New Zealand's nationally determined contribution, which is what we signed up to and have agreed to do under the Paris Agreement, which is a landmark and really significant international agreement on climate change. So we've said that we will reduce emissions, we'll get a 50% of reduction of net emissions below gross 2005 levels by 2030. So we have not much longer to go until 2030. We're not actually on track to meet that, which is a whole other kettle of fish, but that's what we said our target was. And then from that flow, what we said how will we make this happen domestically? And we amended the climate change response act and set out the kind of framework. So at the very top there, we have our 2050 target, and it's a net zero target, although what we call the split gas target. It's net zero for all emissions other than biogenic methane, and a bit more flexible for biogenic methane. and we expect that target to probably change. The government's currently working through quite significantly changing that target in a way that we're a little bit concerned by. That's the 2050 target. And then how do you achieve a target that's out for 2050? Well, you have stepping stones, and that's what these emissions budgets, which are one layer lower in the pyramid, seek to do. So those are every 5 years. In order to reach 2050, we step back every single 5 years and have different budgets, which set out how much carbon or how many emissions can you emit in each 5-year period to set toward 2050. And then below that, we have actually the plans and policies to make it all happen. But they're all geared towards meeting the 2050 target, which is geared towards meeting our Paris Agreement and NDC obligations. That's kind of how they work together. Okay, so it's pretty important because what New Zealand does in its targets and its NDCs filters down to all of the policies, as I showed you there. The target at the top matters, because if the target's wrong, all of the policies and strategies that you're going to be using to implement that target aren't actually going to be on the money. That's why this matters so much. And what we say, and we brought a case against them in the High Court and appealed it, and had a hearing at the BAT in November last year and awaiting a decision. What we say is that New Zealand's emissions budget and our NDC don't put New Zealand on track to reduce emissions in the way that the IPCC we need to do, says that we need to do in order to align ourselves with a 1.5 degree Paris Agreement target. And that fundamentally what happened is that New Zealand has stepped back and just gone, what is feasible for what we can do for emissions reduction, not what is consistent with our Paris Agreement obligations, what is actually consistent with a 1.5 degree trajectory. And we say that that's actually an error of law. So that's one part of it. We're actually fundamentally, our target's not consistent with what the rest of the world is doing and not consistent with what's required for the world to meet its climate ambition targets. But even kind of worse than that, lying sort of below the sea level, is that New Zealand, in setting its targets, has made them sound a lot better than they are by essentially using creative math that no one else in the world is using. So it said, we're applying the IPCC, that's the International Panel on Climate Change scientists, huge, globally respected body of science. Not a single court around the world, to my knowledge, has ever disagreed with IPCC science. So the government has said, we're applying IPCC science, and that's how we're deriving our targets. But what they've actually done is, instead of applying what the IPCC does, which is say net emissions in 2030 have to be X% lower than net emissions in 2020, they're actually comparing apples and oranges in New Zealand. So instead of a net approach, which is what the rest of the world does, we use what's called a net gross approach. And so we're saying that net emissions in 2030 will be X% lower than gross 2010 levels. But gross emissions are what happens before any kind of removals, basically from forestry, are taken out. And that means that the levels set are a little bit different. And essentially what it means is that by saying that we're doing what the IPCC says that we would do, by saying that what we do, by saying that we're doing what the rest of the world is doing and meeting those Paris Agreement targets, when you dig into the detail for how we actually reach the outcome, by using this net growth approach, we're actually not. And the graph that I've got at the very bottom there actually shows you how under our targets, right, which we're aiming for a reduction in emissions, because a reduction in emissions is how we're going to stop the worst effects of global climate change. Our target, net emissions will actually increase because of this creative math, which we really say is not on. And it shows that under Aotearoa, under New Zealand's targets, our net emissions will actually be higher from the period 2021 to 2030 than in any of the previous 3 decades, which doesn't seem particularly consistent with a target and with an agreement and legal framework that says we're reducing emissions. We've also used a pretty creative way of counting forestry removal. We've done this in New Zealand because we rely so heavily on forestry and are only intending to continue relying very heavily on forestry to meet our climate targets. But the whole way in which we calculate them, again, we're not using the same methodology that the rest of the world uses for targeting for calculating our forestry removal, which again leads to the problem of having targets and having an approach which is sounding a lot better than it is. So that case is another one to keep your eyes out for. We should be having a judgment on that any day soon. And so standing back, just before I open it up for questions, why does all of this matter? I've taken you through stories and details and cases around the world. Why does it make a difference? Why should you care about climate litigation as a tool for responding to the climate crisis? Well, one, as you can see, it enforces the law. And there's a fantastic stat here, which is 70% of international greenwashing cases have actually been successful. We're very much hoping that our Z Energy case falls in this camp. You can get wins through the courts that actually require companies and governments to be more ambitious. Two, you can also increase the ambition and integrity in the way that government and decision makers and companies approach their emissions. When we take the Climate Change Commission or we take the Minister for Climate Change to court, it requires evidence. People have to back up what they say in a robust public hearing, in a public forum. And ultimately, we think that sunlight is a really good disinfectant. But it also allows you to develop the law, and that's what you're seeing in a case like Smith and Fonterra. How can we fundamentally change the law, particularly the common law, which is judge-made law, to better respond to and address the climate crisis? That's a really powerful tool. But even outside of the courtroom, climate litigation matters. It can further just sort of reform. That's the kind of thing you're seeing in Europe, with one case potentially impacting what other jurisdictions have to do. Increases pressure on decision makers who don't want to be taken to court. They want to make the right decision in the very first instance. So it makes a really big difference there. Increases financial risk on potential defendants. Again, if there's a chance of you being sued and actually losing money, losing market share, then that's a reason to, again, just make a good decision and try to comply your best with the law at the very first instance. Other point is it helps shape narratives, and I think about this a lot when we talk about climate change as a human rights issue. It's legal terminology, but it makes a real big difference to the way that we talk and think about climate change, even outside the courtroom. And then finally, opening avenues for new cases. What happens on one side of the world can make huge differences to litigation on the other side of the world. And I think that even if a particular case fails, often it's laying the groundwork and laying the kind of sprinkles that other cases can pick up and potentially make successful, which is, I think, a really important. But that's a little bit more about Lawyers for Climate Action and a real quick tour through global climate litigation, trends, what we're seeing, what might be to come. I'm very happy now to take questions, and also happy to stop screen sharing, if that would be good.
Yes, excellent. Now we get a full picture of you. That's very good. That was fascinating. I learned a lot in that.
I'm glad.
Thank you very much. The cases were very interesting indeed. Now, Jenny Easton has a question about the last case that
Yes.
you talked about. When do you expect that case to reach the appeal court?
So it already has actually reached an appeal court. So we've been working on this for a number of years. We took it to the High Court and lost in the High Court on much of the substance. And so the case last year was with the Court of Appeal, and that was November last year. I really would expect the case any day, and it will only go up to the Supreme Court if either we or the Climate Change Commission and the Minister for Climate Change choose to repeal it. So there's no definite date for even or decision on if it will even reach an appeal court. If we win, I don't think we'll appeal it. We'll be pretty happy with the win, so maybe you'll never see it go any further. But what's the space? It's a little bit for me to tell. But I would expect the decision to come out in the next couple of months. If it was later than 1 year after the case, the courts normally try and have decisions out 3 months after a hearing. So to be honest, it's taking a really long time.
Thank you. Okay. Now, the next question says, brilliant work. How can people who are not working as lawyers help?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's lots of ways. One is, I mean, law is one thing, But what we often do in law is just translate what scientific and social science and other experts actually have to say into the legal field, into the courtroom. So we work really closely with scientists and policy experts and economists in particular in building all of our cases. So that's one way in which non-lawyers can help. We're also a membership-based organisation. So if you want to be a member of Lawyers for Climate Action, receive updates on our cases, become part of our wider community, and if there are ways which you could input which aren't through the law, but perhaps you've got expertise or connections or experience that might be relevant, we always do welcome that. So feel free to sign up as a member. And I mean, the other thing is we're a charity. And so we entirely rely on donations for our work, and litigation can be really expensive. So when we brought our Climate Change Commission and case against the government, so we lost in the High Court, and the Commission actually saw costs against us. So if you lose the case, you can be subject to a cost order. And they tried to get $130,000 of costs from us, which would have bankrupted us basically as an organisation. Would have been incredibly difficult for us to continue. So we managed to fight off the cost order, but it's always a risk, and particularly the bolder climate litigation you get, thinking about these kinds of corporate accountability cases, the scarier the cost liability, to be honest. And so sharing the word and encouraging people to donate to our kind of climate litigation and advocacy pot is always just incredibly helpful. So yeah, so those are all really great ways.
Thank you. Then Robin Schiff also asks this question. Robin, thank you to Robin, was the person who suggested having this webinar. So yes, what is the potential of bringing human rights cases about climate in New Zealand?
What a fantastic question. This is something we think about quite a lot. There's already one also being brought by Mike Smith, arguing for a right to life under the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, which hasn't really gained any traction so far, to be honest, but it's there, and will continue kind of moving through the court. We think there is potential, and this is why what I said in terms of the ICJ advisory opinion, that's going to be really, really significant, because there's been a whole heap of human rights-based submissions to the ICJ. And if the ICJ frames climate change as a human rights issue and says that's an international legal obligation, that could open up new pathways for new arguments in New Zealand, for instance. So I think that could be really powerful. But we also think, I mean, my own view is that just as the right to a sustainable environment is a fundamental right for all other human rights, I think there is something really fundamental here that we're dealing with, even just more from a legal perspective. Potentially, that climate change and the right to a habitable planet is a fundamental, what you call common law right, that decisions have to be consistent with. And so we at Lawyers for Climate Action, I mean, when I say we, I'm the only full-time employee, well, only employee full stop actually at Lawyers for Climate Action. So me and our volunteer lawyers are working a way to try work out what kind of hooks we could pull on more of that human rights lens. But I think it's a really important one. And internationally, I'd say human rights climate litigation is one of the most kind of successful and numerous types of climate litigation. It just hasn't really reached New Zealand. And so that's our challenge, is to try bring it to our shores.
Thanks, Jessica. Can I follow up that question from Robin with a question about the further outcome of the human rights cases? Has there been an evaluation of what follows when a human rights case is won?
Yes, and I think that's a really important point. So it differs court to court. So in some courts in South America, the court actually has a kind of supervisory function, so can continue monitoring and actually meeting with governments to say, are you following the court order? Are you kind of following and complying with the law? That's one thing that can happen. Another thing that can happen is if a state is found not to comply, then they could just be sued again and then make it kind of happen, and then the kind of ratcheting up of responsibility. And so you see that happen in some other parts of the world as well. And I think that overall, though, you have touched on one of those tricky points. And in New Zealand, we've got a system where ultimately Parliament can kind of do what it likes within some boundaries. But generally we have a system which is very differential to Parliament, who can ultimately legislate away what courts say. And you see that, Portia and Seabed back in 2004 is a perfect example for where that can happen. So it's always a risk that you have a court say one thing and then a Parliament do the other. But part of this is, and this is part of why I think part of the importance and value of climate litigation is outside the courtroom. And so if you have a judgment that says the government is not complying with human rights, what's the impact that we can have from that decision and from that kind of narrative shaping to advocacy and expectations and norms and standard settings outside the courtroom. So I think that kind of civil society function is a really important one, even outside of a courtroom to hold government to account.
Thank you. Okay, the next one strangely has my name against it, but it's not from me. It must be some other JS. Given the success of various legal actions, has there been any evidence of blowback in terms of legal changes to make such litigation less successful in the future?
So yes, and we always have to it's a very delicate line, and it's why you won't see us as an organisation, for instance, just filing dozens of cases. We're really careful with the cases we bring because you sometimes see pushback. And we're very conscious, again, as I said earlier, Parliament can ultimately change the law. So we have a really robust legal framework with the Climate Change Response Act, but Parliament can choose to change the legislation to legislate away litigation risk. And you do see that happening, not so much in New Zealand, at least not yet, which is a good thing, but that is absolutely a risk. And so you do see that, I think, you do see that certainly internationally, and it is a risk domestically as well. And even where legislative change doesn't happen, sometimes what you also see is the threat of litigation just making companies or governments paper over the cracks a little bit, and make a decision on the boundary between kind of being a decision that complies with the law and a decision that doesn't, which then makes it really difficult to challenge, particularly in light of that cost risk that I mentioned earlier. Every time you're bringing a case, there's a real risk of losing and then having to spend a lot of money defending a cost order. And so if the government makes it really difficult to challenge or a lot more tenuous in terms of the prospects of success, that's also a real kind of deterrent. I think the other thing to say is climate litigation isn't always brought by kind of groups like us or groups like yours. There are some cases of litigation being brought by kind of actors in the fossil fuel industry, for instance. Not really in New Zealand, but there's been some litigation internationally actually against climate activists, and so you see it, and it's called kind of SLAP litigation. You do sometimes see it being used in slightly more nefarious ways, I would say. So it's not always the perfect vehicle and the perfect solution, always perfectly aligned with climate outcomes. It can be a little more complicated than that.
Something to be concerned about. This question from C. Kern, he or she says it's an opportunistic question. Do you have any statement or direction to help inform submissions urgently underway this weekend on the Crown Minerals Amendment Bill, reversing the ban on new petroleum exploration permits near Taranaki? And Chris Wheatley follows with a very closely related question. Is there a legal way to object to a 4-day consultation period? And I wanted to know that too. So
yeah, no, I know. And I spent a little bit of my afternoon on this as well. I was shocked actually to see 4-day consultation period. I haven't delved into the detail yet in terms of whether that would be challengeable. I mean, it's challenging something on the basis of consultation is always really difficult in New Zealand. But it depends as well on the statute, and I haven't looked into that. So we've been writing letters and doing engagement behind the scenes in relation to consultation on the emissions reduction plan, and also New Zealand's NDC. Particularly the emissions reduction plan, there's actually a duty in the statute for adequate consultation. And so we raised some questions there about whether the consultation was adequate given the information provided. I don't think on the top of my head there's anything similar, unfortunately, in the Crown Minerals Act that would require kind of a degree of adequacy. If there was, I think it would be quite easy to say the 4 days doesn't enable adequate consultation. There could be questions as well in terms of the Crown's obligations with Māori, which is just under Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and I would be surprised if 4 day consultation period was sufficient to discharge those obligations, to be honest. But it's not an issue I've looked into a lot in the last couple of hours. But I absolutely, when we will be as an organisation. In terms of statements on submissions, I think that from a legal perspective, but perhaps before I get onto that, I think the IPCC and the UN have both quite clearly said, and I think again it's very, very reputable evidence to rely on, that extracting more resources is incompatible with what's required to meet our Paris Agreement targets and to avoid the worst of the climate crisis. Um, and so I think that is probably the first place that our submission points start, is that the evidence is that this is not compatible with what we need to do. It's the opposite of what we need to be doing. Again, the difficult tension we have here is that ultimately Parliament can largely change the law however it sees fit, although we're really interested in testing out some of the boundaries, and this kind of case may be one of those ones where you test the boundaries of what Parliament can and cannot do for the planet. But we still do have international legal obligations, and under the Climate Change Response Act, the Minister for Climate Change has a duty to ensure that each emissions budget is met. And so if you remember that slide where I gave out that pyramid, they're all obligations and enforceable obligations, some of them. And so if these kinds of decisions are actually going to take New Zealand off track for any of those, that is relevant, and I think a point that people should make in their submissions. If it's inconsistent with our domestic emissions budget and 2050 target, those are legally enforceable and could be risked against the Minister for Climate Change. And also think about international obligations. So think about what we signed up to under the Paris Agreement. Think about what we signed up to with the European Union free trade agreement, which actually has a provision which means that New Zealand could be subject to trade sanctions if we aren't seen to be effectively implementing our Paris Agreement obligations. I think these are all good points to make in a submission, and I think to really question whether this kind of legislation aligns with those commitments. From a drafting perspective, I am also quite concerned by the potential change to the purpose of the bill. I think it moves from it's going to adopt wording, I think, promote or encourage extraction. It's something along those lines with the purpose statement. The Crown Minerals Act is actually been subject to ongoing litigation, which we've been supporting a little bit. Our co-founder, James Palmer, is acting for a group of students who's been challenging some decisions made under the Crown Minerals Act in the case of Students for Climate Solutions. That's one of those cases, again, casting your mind back, that tries to integrate climate considerations, and so to say that you can't grant exploration permits without taking climate change into account. And the courts have actually been batting that back, so they lost at the Court of Appeal, which we think is a real shame. But my understanding is that they're currently seeking leave to appeal, and the Supreme Court is interested in picking it up. And one of the grounds of appeal there are, even when you're making a decision under the Crown Minerals Act in relation to petroleum exploration permits, say, that you have to take climate change into account, and specifically you have to take New Zealand's climate targets under the Climate Change Response Act into account. Now, that's actually a mandatory relevant consideration in your decision. And the Supreme Court picks it up. That will be a point that I imagine would form quite a significant part of that judgment. And I think that is relevant content for the government to think about when they're even looking at amending the Act. It kind of goes to that question that was asked earlier. Maybe the government is just trying to legislate the risk away. But then can they fully legislate away responsibility for climate change and the relationship that permits granted under the Crown Minerals Act has on climate change? Can you actually legislate that away, or is the government still opening itself up to risk? Yeah, but those are all points which I imagine we will be making, and I hope a relevant context to you. If you want to describe a descriptor of the student case, we have one that I wrote up on our blog. There's not actually a lot of information about that case, but I wrote a description that I don't think was too legalistic on the website. So feel free to look at that, and that kind of summarizes the law as it stands, which also provides a little bit of context for what's looking at happening now.
That sounds very helpful. Let me make sure I heard that right. So on the website, there
Yeah.
is a description
So if you
and
go to
summary by you of the act.
of the Students for Climate Solutions case, which was brought under the Crown Minerals Act, and
Oh,
the that's about the Crown Minerals Act and to what extent the climate change considerations have to be read into that act. So if you're making a decision on a permit, do you have to still consider the impact of climate change, even though the statute doesn't say you do? So that's what that case is about. And so if you go onto the news tab, it'll be in that either on the front page or the second page. It'll be Students for Climate Solutions. I think that's what it's called, climate considerations or something with Crown Minerals Act or exploration or students, something. One of those words will be in the title of the post. But that might be a helpful resource for you as you prepare your very hurried submission. It's outrageous, to be honest, 4 days of consultation. That will absolutely be a point that we'll make in our submission as well. And we'll see if that goes any further.
it's utterly outrageous, and the 25 participants in this webinar, at least some of you, I think, will be thinking, where can you find an hour or two on the weekend to do this? So your content suggestions are extremely helpful, Jessica, and being able to go to the website to look at your summary of arguments for the other case will be very helpful. So many thanks for them. Okay, now Matthias Otto asks, given the high number of cases in the US, why didn't any of them make it into your shortlist? Is it that the majority was unsuccessful? Is it perhaps that their politically appointed Supreme Court judges are stacked against climate change? And he comments, USA is an influential party in this field.
Look, it's a fantastic question. I didn't tackle US cases in this presentation, A, because of time, B, there's so many US cases and they're a bit more confusing because the US has a slightly different legal system that goes across the federal and the state system. And so a lot of the cases, I think, are just very specific to the US and probably less relevant to New Zealand. It's also just a funny part of New Zealand, kind of the New Zealand judiciary and legal system. We tend not to rely on US cases that much in our courtroom. That's why I haven't really raised them. But they are a very influential party in the field, and climate litigation in the US, it's by far the biggest jurisdiction for climate litigation. As I said, it's just quite specific, kind of state specific, and then federal cases, and they've got their own very specific. Most of their cases are either based on I think all of them have either been really based on state constitutions, which isn't super similar to what we have here, or the kind of specific climate legislation, which is, like the Clean Air Act, I think is one of them, which again, is quite specific to the US context. But that's not to say there aren't some really exciting cases. And if I was to pick one or two, held in Montana, and another case called Juliana, both being brought by groups of young people challenging their state government action on climate change, and they've had actually some measure of success, and they're both going to continue moving through the court. Really exciting pieces of climate litigation coming out of the state, which I don't think have made it all the way up to the Supreme Court for the final substantive relief, but really exciting ones to keep an eye on. There's actually a lot of other really exciting cases coming out of Hawaii. And Hawaii actually seems to have a really progressive court, really progressive state court. So the kind of integrating climate considerations cases I was just talking about, those have gone quite well in Hawaii. I'm pretty sure that the District of Hawaii or the state of Hawaii government even just settled a case brought by a whole group of youth activists in relation to transport, which we were looking at because we're also not too happy with what's happening in the transport space in New Zealand in terms of emissions and our obligations. Um, and the Hawaiian government settled with this group of young people and is committed to um, working on decarbonising its transport system and having better investment in transport as a result of that claim before it even happened to go to court. So there's a lot happening in the US, literally thousands of cases, I think, maybe about 50. Oh, no, maybe not 50%, but a very large number. I could keep talking for an hour. And then I'm sure we could talk through lots of US cases, but I think it is a good question.
Thank you for your answer. And the next question is asked by Michael Stocker, who is a lawyer associated with the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum. Michael says, outside of submissions and litigation, do you engage with government ministers to influence decisions and policy? Is there an openness to hear from you?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot that happens behind the scenes, and so climate litigation, I think, is what we're most known for. But a lot of my work doesn't reach the litigation stage, and is dealt with behind the scenes. We met with the minister earlier this year, who I think was particularly interested in talking to us about the ETS. I think he was, nervous about being found and finding himself in court after what had happened last year. And we had a really constructive meeting with him. And then also, I'd say there's a fair amount of, honestly, letter writing that goes on between us and various ministers' offices. I was in communications with Minister Bailey's office this week. That's the Minister for Consumer and Competition Affairs, I think, who is winding back a whole heap of, or potentially winding back some laws on corporate accountability and ESG governance. So the climate-related disclosures regime and directors' duties, it looked like there could be changes there. So we've written and engaging with him on that. A lot of the consultations have been, as you would know, a lot of consultation on the emissions reduction plan in particular, and also on the ETS. We actually met with officials, I think, twice in the lead up to that ETS decision. We were concerned about some of the adequacy of information that was provided and some of the options that were being floated. And our objective is ultimately to actually avoid having to go to court. We want the right decisions being made in the first instance. So we met with senior officials from MFE in advance of that. I mean, I'm not to say whether that influenced what ultimately happened with the decision there earlier this year, but maybe it did. I hope it did. That a good decision ended up being made. But I think there is some openness to hearing from us. I think we are a credible player in this space, to be honest. I think that our work is kind of making a difference. And in the result of that, there is some openness to engage and try to avoid litigation rather than bring it on by the government.
Here is another question from that other JS. How do your activities relate to local activist groups?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things which we do really think of. How can we, as I think I set that out at the very beginning, we've got this big base, lots of volunteer lawyers wanting to use their legal skills for the climate. And there's so much fantastic community climate action, and your group is a really good example of that. And I mean, we've been working quite a bit this year with the Kaipara community to oppose cuts being made by their council to a lot of climate funding. We have previously supported another community group called All Aboard Aotearoa, bring litigation against Auckland Transport in relation to transport decisions that didn't align with the kinds of emissions reductions that again, the evidence says that it's needed. I'm doing quite a lot of work actually supporting iwi groups in the Waitangi Tribunal at the moment. There's a really big inquiry in the Waitangi Tribunal. Again, I've got to talk about this one as well. It's a claim being brought by a large number of iwi. It's what's called a kaupapa inquiry. So the Waitangi Tribunal is considering whether the Crown's response to climate change breaches Te Tiriti or Waitangi, which is a really significant case. We've got a number of lawyers for climate action members involved, and I'm supporting it as well as a lot of those lawyers, volunteers and working really discounted rates. So we've got a number of lawyers for climate action volunteers providing research support, and I'm helping a bit on that as well. So absolutely, where we can, and I think this is something we'd love to actually level up in doing. We've also got a pro bono matching service, so community groups can come to us and say, here's an issue happening in our community, not too sure what to do about it. Can you guys help and provide any legal assistance? And we're always really keen to do that. So with the answer, we do try to work with local activist groups as much as we can.
Thank you, Jessica. And although we're running out of time, this will be the last question. It's too interesting to miss. Matthias Otto again saying, given quite a few of the presented cases are based on quite fundamental base laws such as the Bill of Rights or tort law, can we have some hope that the current radical repealing and loosening of existing protective statutes, for example, the Fast Track Bill, RMA reform, is not all too worrying?
I mean, my own view is that it all is still quite worrying. So yes, I do think those are worrying reforms. But it's part of the reason I like working in climate litigation in particular, rather than just climate per se. It sometimes can feel like a really overwhelming space to work in, right? I mean, I started at the beginning of this talk with all of those statistics and graphs and extreme weather events and harm that climate change is already causing for the planet. And it sometimes can feel a bit overwhelming, and with government making so many decisions and so much happening, it almost feels like you're in a washing machine with so much to keep on top of. But I do think that climate litigation and legal levers are a bit of a glimmer of hope in some ways, because it's actually a tangible way, at the very least, as I said out earlier, to actually, bring government in the courtroom and say, you've got a duty to meet the next emissions budget. You've got a duty to meet the 2050 target that you've set out. You've got a duty under international law, under the Paris Agreement, to work with the rest of the world to stop warming going above 2 degrees Celsius. How are you doing that? And if you're not doing that, you'll be held accountable in a court of law, and you'll have to provide evidence to support your decision. So this is why I think that law is such an important and powerful lever, and why it's so cool to be able to work in this space in New Zealand, because all of that stuff is really worrying. A lot of the decisions that we're seeing are really worrying. But at the end of the day, so long as there are strong legal obligations relating to climate change, government, even though government can legislate away climate risk to some extent, until they do that, they still have to follow the law. So long as you have to follow the law, and so long as there are strong climate laws in place, I think there is some hope, and the law can be a useful tool for increasing ambition and increasing accountability. It plays a really important role.
You've made a very good case for that proposition, Jessica. Thank you very much. That was such an interesting session. I do feel much better educated on the role of the law in our great collective struggle. So thank you so much. And
no, thank you so much for having me, and for all of your work as well, and for joining me for an hour and a half on a Thursday evening to talk about climate. Really grateful, and it's just fantastic to be able to see so many of you here. So feel free to sign up and receive our newsletters and follow our work, and I'll be sure to do the same for you as well.
Thanks, Jessica. I will, and thanks everyone for your active participation and your excellent questions. And I'm seeing warm gratitude on the chat here. I will close with a karakia, and it's one that I often use, using the imagery of we've been out paddling together on a waka in unity, and we're back to shore. And may we feel our unity and togetherness. Ko te hā, ko te pō, ko tangaroa, ko te mana, ko te kotahitanga o ngā mātāwaka. Haumi e, hui e, taiki e.